There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean of Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. I'm definitely filming this indoors today. It's currently 31 degrees and it's gonna go up even more. It's just before 1 p.m. I've had a really productive reading week, but I don't have much to show for it because I'm made significant progress with some big tomes, one of which I'm ready to do a preliminary check on, but the rest of it's just, I'm not quite done a bunch of books that you'll hear about it in the coming weeks. And I don't have any personal news, it's just too damn hot. Oh, I have a new blouse. So I'm happy about that. That cheers me up immensely. This is not really news, but it's just a little anecdote that I'm delighted to share with you about Kenji. I told you a few weeks back that everything was approved and he just had to submit some updated passport photos and a bunch of small little things like that, and he did that 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or something. And there's no change in his mom's condition, but he did those last few steps, and then he got an email from the Canadian Immigration Visa Processing Center in Tokyo, and he said, I got this strange email, can you tell me what it's about? And so he forwarded it to me, and it was using kind of bureaucratic language, but all it said was, his documents are ready for pickup. But he didn't understand what it meant, and so I explained it to him in simpler English. His English is really good, but, reading correspondence from bureaucrats is a challenge for the rest of us, too. So I said, oh no, it's just ready for you to pick up. It's not his permanent resident card. That comes only after he gets to Canada. But what I suspect these papers are the actual documents that he needs to show at his first point of landing, which when he flies to Canada, which it'll probably be Vancouver, and at the customs or immigration, he has to show these papers, and then they give him the stamp that he's officially a permanent resident of Canada, and then the permanent resident card comes in the mail here to this address after that. But when I explained all that to him, he said, oh, so they didn't reject me? And I thought, oh my God, he didn't really quite grasp that the previous communication had announced that everything was done, other than these last few things he had to submit. So he was quite worried that at the last minute, this would be snatched away. His Canadian life, his Canadian future would be snatched away. He would be denied. And when he realized that that's not what it was, he was just so overjoyed. So this was just through text chat on a text chatting app very popular in Japan called Line, and just made my day. So, with all the delays, all the ways in which the universe has conspired to keep us apart for 2 years plus now, the fact that he was as excited as he was, realizing that everything was a go and he could still come to Canada once his situation there with his family sorts itself out, he said euphemistically, was like music to my ears. So life is beautiful. Let's see who this week's mystery guest is, shall we? And this week's mystery guest is Vincent Anioke, a Nigerian-Canadian writer joining us from Waterloo, Ontario. His debut work of fiction is a collection of short stories called Perfect Little Angels. Just came out April in Canada, May in the States. Welcome, Vincent.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh boy, it's a real treat to have you here. Your short story collection came to my attention, was it late winter or early spring? CBC Books section puts out a forthcoming article about forthcoming titles, and this was one of the ones that caught my eye, and now a few months later, here we are having a chat. I've already told Vincent offline that once I've had a chance to read the stories, I want to have him back for a long-form chat, but we thought maybe one way to dive into talking about this collection is to show you a gorgeous, wonderful book trailer that has been created. One of the first questions I'm going to ask Vincent after we watch it is, did he make it or who made it? It's beautiful. So let's watch that trailer now. So, did you make that, Vincent? That was gorgeous.
No, thank you. I did not make that, but I knew I wanted a very visual introduction of the book to the world. And so I found out that the Writers Trust of Canada, when they nominate books for awards, usually creates book trailers for those books. And so I tracked down the graphic designer who makes those trailers and emailed him saying, "Hey, can we work together?" His name is Jan Rosa. He's so talented. It took us several months of back and forth to land on the trailers, but there were actually three trailers made for the book.
Yeah, well, I'll link to your website or your YouTube channel because I think at least two of them are there. Yeah, so.
Yep.
And that trailer introduces us to one of the stories in a really teasing way, really grabs our interest. So tell us more about that story in particular, including the title.
It is the first story in the collection. It's called Obuefi. The story kind of gives you more context as to what Obuefi is about. I kind of have my book up here as well. So it's the first story in the collection. And I like it because I'm starting the book through the eyes of this very young boy. He's 7 years old. And the very first paragraph of the story has his dad coming home and saying, "Hey, Chibike," no, the boy's name, Chibike, "it is time. This weekend, you'll become an Obuefi." And the boy spends most of the weekend living in a state of very deep anxiety. He's worried, he's paralyzed by fear. And so you get a sense that this ceremony, whatever it is, means a lot to him, to his family. So immediately you feel the weight of expectations put on this boy. You feel his concern about what happens if he, does this wrong. At some point in the story, he asks his mom, "I'm very nervous about this ceremony. What happens if I mess up?" And she looks at him for a long time and she says, "You won't, you won't mess up." So it's almost like failure is not an option. And I love the story for the introduction because it does set up one of the central themes of the book, which is how characters in Nigeria, as well as just humans in general, deal with expectations, how we worry about living up to standards, and what happens when we don't live up to standards.
These stories, I believe, I've heard them described as all being set wholly, or at least in part, in Nigeria. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So in the book itself, there are 14 stories, with 11 set in Nigeria and three set in Canada.
I believe some of them are very, very gay.
Yeah, so there are three or four stories in here that have like super queer themes, including a queer romance between two men.
That's great. Well, you've got my attention. Um, so what's in the water that there's all these wonderful queer Nigerian writers coming out of the water or the woodwork?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking of the same thing myself. I know in 2020 we had this huge End SARS protest. It was a protest against police brutality in Nigeria, and it featured primarily young Nigerians coming together and lending their voice, to this cause against the corrupt police, the corrupt government. And unfortunately, the End SARS process was disbanded violently by the government. But I think since then, that sense of resolution against the way things are in the country has just grown stronger. I think it's emboldened a lot of voices, especially queer voices, because right now, queerness in Nigeria is a thing that's subject to shame and prejudice. It is suppressed. It's against state and federal law to be queer. And it's just so, like, Nigeria has so many problems. So to have this one thing be our focus, this one thing that's about someone's humanity that we can't change, it's so unfair. And I think in the aftermath of the 2020 protests, I've seen a lot of queer writing come out of the country, which makes me really happy. And I'm proud to contribute, to that discourse.
Absolutely. And I can't think myself of one work of queer fiction that came out of Nigeria before 2020. Can you?
Yeah, there's a few of them, but I feel
Okay.
like they're few and far between. Like we've really
It's
seen the
really,
surge of them, yeah, come out more recently.
and then, there's a larger question I have to ask you. What is in the water that there's so much wonderful literary fiction coming out of Nigeria, not just queer, but all kinds of wonderful literary fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up learning that my ancestors were storytellers. We sat around the fire and told stories. Our grandfathers told grandson stories about the way of the world, the way of their world, how to live in our society. And yeah, I grew up learning of myself as a storyteller. And we find our different mediums. Some choose writing, some choose other mediums. But I think there is a heritage that goes way beyond the written word. And so we're just continuing in that tradition.
On your website, you talk about yourself as a boy writing a story. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the very first story I ever wrote, I was 7 years old. And the story was called The Cries of Emeka. I wrote it on the lined pages of my primary school notebook, and I'm not quite sure what drew me toward that. I have my theories looking back on that now. I grew up around books growing up in Nigeria. Like my dad had a huge library, and so I grew up reading stories and then wanting to tell my own stories. As for that particular story, it's about a young boy, so a boy my age back then, whose mom gives him money to go buy bread for the family. And the boy goes out and he doesn't buy bread for the family. He buys ice cream for himself. And so comes home with ice cream that he's eaten and no food for the family. And so his mom disowns him, and he ends up on the street. He becomes homeless. He gets picked up by this police officer who gets killed by a bunch of robbers. Like it goes on this very meandering, sort of insane plot line. And then his mom takes him back at the very end and forgives him, and all is well, happily ever after. So yeah, I'm not quite sure why I wrote that story, but I think there's some anxieties there about doing right by your parents that still feel very relevant to me today. But yeah, it was when I realized for the first time in my life, yeah, I enjoy writing.
Well, and the rest, as they say, is history. Although, like many writers, there was a meandering path towards you getting into writing as an adult. Isn't that right?
Oh, that's completely right. Yes. In high school, I wrote again some more. So in Nigeria, it's very common to go to a boarding school for high school. So for 6 years, I lived away from home on this campus grounds from grade 7 to 12, and we had a very regimented schedule. So you wake up at 5 a.m. and then you shower, and then you have breakfast, and then class, and then nap time, and then study time, and then dinner, and then bedtime. And so outside of classes, there's not much to do. People become bored and angsty, and I channeled all my boredom and angstiness into writing. And so, over the course of those years, I wrote a 6-part, 2,000-page science fiction series called Sagittarius by hand. And I actually still have all of it with me. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so this is 2,000 pages of science fiction that I wrote in high school. And that was just purely for fun, for escapism. Like the plot was incoherent. I'm sure there are all kinds of plot twists. It's not at all publishable. It was just for the love of writing and to escape somewhere. And then in university, I studied computer science and engineering at MIT in the States. But I took a few electives in creative writing. And this one professor, her name was Helen Lee. She read my first story in that class. And it was a story that was written primarily to inspire shock and awe in the audience. And she told me, you have excellent prose, but this feels like it was made just to shock us. And if you're going to shock us towards something. And so she was hinting at this idea of like writing to a theme in mind, like writing that reflects the inside rather than just wants to create a reaction from the reader. And I think that's really changed the direction of my stories, where they became like a lot more humanistic and a lot more reflective of my real life concerns about the world. And then after graduation, I moved to Canada. And for the first year, I was not writing at all. I was just trying to do well at my job, not get fired, make friends, figure out this new country. But I did miss writing. I did miss writing. And I didn't realize that I missed writing so much until one night when I couldn't sleep. And it was the most bizarre thing. I felt this weird itch on my palm. And I imagined sentient teeth sprouting in a circle on my hand. And I imagined myself picking up a knife to remove the teeth. And I imagined the teeth like striking back. I got up, went to my laptop, and started writing. And I wrote 1,000 words of this teeth-based horror story that actually felt like there was a subtext of depression in that story. Like it made it feel deeper than just the teeth itself. And that weekend, I sort of sent the story around to a bunch of magazines, and the UK-based horror journal ended up picking up that story and publishing it. And I realized, oh, I can actually get stuff published. And that began a part of me writing new stories and trying to get them published in different magazines. Although, unlike the first story, which was horror, these new ones were more literary fiction. And so for a few years, I began writing and publishing literary fiction stories. And I think that's when I really found my groove as the writer I am today. That's when I said, okay, there's enough stories here that I can think about a collection for the future.
Well, and as somebody who is not much into reading horror fiction, although I did read a horror novel this year for the first time since I was maybe 17, and an aficionado of literary fiction, I'm glad your writing went in the direction it did, Vincent.
Thank
So
you.
I'm gonna steal your MIT creative writer professor's question. If these stories are shocking, what are they shocking us towards? And maybe they're not necessarily shocking, but tell us about the overarching themes of this collection, if that's an answerable question.
Yeah, so definitely. I think, there might be some moments of charged shock in the stories. I think they shock us about the things that are true about our real lives. There are things that I find shocking that don't require the creation of vampires or demons. I'm shocked by how colors family can be to each other. I'm shocked by how a country can treat its most vulnerable citizens. I'm shocked at the kind of violence we're capable of as human beings. And I'm shocked at the ways that love can both transform and destroy us. The things that we do in the name of love. And I think at the heart of these 14 stories, the connecting thread is unconditional love. What does it mean to want love? What does it mean to be loved just for being who you are? What does it mean to be loved with conditions? And what do we do when we don't feel like we're loved? What do we do when we let shame into our hearts? What kind of behaviors do we create from shame? So this pull and push between love and shame, between trying to find love and trying to just exist and receive love, it underpins a lot of these stories.
Underpins a lot of life. If I hadn't already bought the book, I would be running right out to buy the book. So I've already got the book, so it means I'm going to read it that much earlier because those themes really deeply appeal to me.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So, why short stories?
Well, short stories are to me perfect for so many reasons. I feel like when you're working on a novel, which I am, I have a novel in the works currently. You're sort of locked into this one grand idea for like a very long period of time. And with a short story, you're able to, in the same time span, experiment with many ideas. So I love the flexibility that short stories offer you. And short stories, to me, like writing them really taught me about how to write well, because there's so much less room for wasted space. Every word, every sentence is more muscular. You demand more from yourself with each line. You try to write lines that move the plot forward and reveal character and also have a lyrical quality to them. And so I feel like the focus of short stories made me a stronger writer. Short stories also let you play with form sometimes. Like you can write a short story in a very traditional style, but you can also write a short story that's in the form of, honestly, a receipt. I read a very innovative short story a couple of months back, and it was written as a person's bank statement. And so you read through the story, and it's literally just a list of what they bought on a certain month. And so they bought a gym membership, so they're trying to get better. They bought dating app subscriptions, so they're trying to find love. They got a refund on the gym membership, so they canceled their gym membership. And then they're buying flowers, buying a dress, so you can tell, okay, this could be for a date, something is happening. They bought 2 tickets to see a movie. They bought dinner. So, okay, the date is happening. And then the story sort of takes a dark turn when they're paying hospital bills. So something must have gone wrong on the date. They're paying for blood work. They're paying for self-defense classes. They're paying for a gun. So with just this ordering of what this person purchased in a certain month, tell this pretty harrowing story of a date gone wrong. And I was so impressed that, you could do that and have that be a story. I feel like it's very hard to do that with a novel. For a full-length novel, that could be much harder. But short stories really let you play with form.
Absolutely. You don't happen to remember the author or of that story, bank statement story?
I do have it written down here. I can definitely pull it up. It's called Accounts. The story itself is called Accounts. Accounts by Namwali Serpel.
Oh, yes. She's which African country does she hail from? I've blanked.
She's from Zambia.
Zambia, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least two well-received novels in the last
Mhm.
5 or 10 years. Yeah.
Also, fun fact, I also do read about 10 to 20 stories a week for a US-based literary journal. They're called Smoke Long Quarterly. Yeah, it's very interesting being, behind the scenes of a journal and helping them decide what to publish and what not to publish. First of all, it's just nice seeing the range of stories that writers all over the world are coming up with. We get stories from the very grounded to the very fantastical. We get stories about grief and loss and addiction, very serious topics, but also like very humorous and moving and funny stories. And yeah, you kind of get a sense for patterns, like which story themes tend to recur and which story themes tend to be done well. Like I've read so many stories that are about a son or daughter grieving their father or mother. Get many stories set in a hospital. Someone is dying, and they're painting a picture of the hospital machines and the antiseptic smell in the corridors. And those stories are very sad. But when you read enough of them, you almost begin to want more from those stories about grief. What can you do to be more distinctive? And so, yeah, you kind of learn that the story can be well written, but also over familiar. And it kind of encourages you to like find new avenues for your own writing.
And so you're working on a novel now. What, if anything, would you care to tell us about it?
So it's very early, so I don't want to say too much about it just yet. I will say that it reimagines a portion of the world. So it's not rooted in our contemporary reality. It's in the near future in Nigeria, in a place that doesn't exist currently. And it reimagines certain aspects of Nigeria's social and political reality.
So, what are you discovering so far in the early stages of drafting this novel to be some of the major differences, things that are more challenging, perhaps things that are easier about writing a novel compared to short stories?
So the scope is much larger, and I find myself realizing that there's a lot that I don't know about this particular topic that I'm investigating. So it's much more research heavy than it was with the short story collections, where many of the stories in the collection hewed very closely to things that I knew and things I was familiar with. So there's a lot more research for this novel. And there's a lot more questions about the direction of the novel. With a short story, you can change directions really easily and have that not be too expensive. But with the novel, it's definitely different. I changed the direction of the novel recently, like a few weeks ago. I decided that previous format wasn't really working, and a new format was required to tell the story effectively. And that meant getting rid of 20,000 words. So I had 20,000 words go from main story to backstory. And, that's a major quote unquote loss. But at the same time, it's not really a loss because I still know a lot about these characters, even though all those words might not appear in the actual text of the book. Like they do inform my knowledge of how the characters behave in the world of the novel. So it's definitely a different medium of engagement, and I'm getting more familiar with it.
Sounds so interesting. Let's hear about Vincent the Reader. What have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend?
There are two books that I would recommend. One is a queer novel. It's called Pomegranate by Helen Lee. It's an American novel. Came out last year, I believe, and it's about a woman in a maximum security prison who's leaving and trying to rebuild her life. So she's trying to stay clean, stay clean of drugs, trying to get her children back into her custody, trying to find love, trying to do all these things that are so hard to do when you've been locked away for so long. And the way the story is told is just so deeply human that there was a point in the story where I just began crying. And I think about her every day. So I would definitely recommend Pomegranate by Helen Lee.
And I think you had one more book you wanted to recommend, Vincent.
Oh, yes. So there's a book called Blessings by Chukwuebuka Ibeh. It's a recent queer Nigerian novel. I read it last month and I just loved it. So it tells a story about this boy, this young, sensitive boy, whose dad is very strict. The boy has some somewhat feminine traits that the dad already very strongly disapproves of. And when the dad catches the boy having a moment with a housekeeper that dad has hired, he sends the boy to a Christian boarding school. And so a lot of lessons is set in that boarding school where the boy has to navigate his masculinity. He has to learn a lot of very tough lessons about how to exist in Nigeria as a man, how to suppress his queerness, how to, have sex with women, even though he has no attraction to them, and sometimes how to enact violence himself as a way to survive. And so that becomes a very harrowing and very, complex but so true portrayal. So the second point of view in the story is the boy's mother, and you learn how powerless she feels sometimes against the dad's force, as head of the household. But you also get the sense of defiance she has against him, and the sense of love she has for her son, despite him being different. She wishes he wasn't who he was, but not because of bigotry, but because the world is so cruel and so hard for him as it is. And so I think the 2 points of views between the boy and the mother really paint a complete picture of how difficult it is navigating a Nigerian household as a queer person.
Well, we didn't plan this at all, but I just started reading Blessings this week. So I've only read about 12 pages. You gave me a clear idea of what I'm in for without spoiling anything. So that was a wonderful description. And yeah, based on the first 10 or 15 pages, it's starting out really good. So I'm looking forward to continuing it.
Oh, you're in for a treat.
Yes, yes. From the queer Nigerian fiction I've read, it seems to tackle homophobia, internalized and can I say externalized
Hmm.
homophobia head on, and also queer shame very directly in a way that I don't find most the English speaking Western world does.
Right?
I would compare it to like Edouard Louis, the French queer writer, where he tackles those themes head on. But and all of the Nigerian queer fiction that I've read really does, and I think that's why it has a special place in my heart.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And to me, it makes sense. Like Nigerian homophobia, there's no sense of subtlety about it. It's very loud, it's very direct, it's very consequential. And so I think the only response to that in fiction is, the same, a head-on approach.
It certainly speaks directly to me growing up in the 1970s and 1980s in small town Saskatchewan, Canada.
Do you feel like that has changed a lot? Like have they come a long way since then?
Yes, yes, in so many important ways, things have changed, but I think there is still a lot of leftover homophobia, both externally, and certainly in political terms, there's backlash in North America, but also an internalized homophobia that despite the fact that there's so many positive role models and all that stuff, it's still psychologically challenging as well as socially challenging to be out and proud, or at least be out and not beating the crap out of yourself.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but I'm glad there's progress.
Oh, absolutely. There has been a lot of progress. So, oh my goodness, Vincent, this has been really fascinating. I hope you'll come back and talk to me again someday.
Oh, definitely. Yes, once you've read the book, I would love to come back and do a deeper dive into, uh, my short story collection.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, Vincent.
No, thank you.
Yes, Vincent was a great guest. I'm as intrigued as all get out to finally get into this short story collection. I love that cover, eh? I meant to ask him about the cover. We talked about the cover before I turned the recorder on. The cover art is by Julian Adon Alexander, and that portrait is called Was Anything I Did Worth It from 2023. And I just forgot to ask him about it again once the recorder was on, but we had a wonderful chat. This week was more about reading than editing booktube videos, so I only managed to get one book haul video up on my channel. I'd hoped to have a zooming in video finished and ready to post, but that didn't happen. So that may or may not be the next video that goes up. I want to get some non-standard videos up next week, so I may not have any of my standard zooming in or book haul videos in the coming week. I might have some different stuff. In terms of Patreon, I have no new patrons to tell you about this week, but I'm hoping that might change soon. But I do have news about Patreon. The poll for what the next few book club books, I've abandoned the term read along. I think it's just too confusing. So from now on, when I talk about this benefit on my Patreon, it's just book club. So the top vote, well, there was a tie for top vote. And so Margaret Lawrence's famous novel, The Stone Angel, will be our first read, and it'll be probably at the end of September. We're still sorting out the exact date, and I'm really excited about that. I read and loved The Stone Angel when I was in high school. The protagonist is Hagar Shipley, a 90-year-old woman, so I think I'm going to have a very different experience of this novel now that I'm much closer to her age than I him to being a high school student, but really excited about that. So, my reading week. I have one Bale to tell you about, and I'm going to start with that. And then I have one book that I've read the first 50 pages, so I'll give you a preliminary report and tell you about a couple books I'm going to start in the coming days. This might be the first Bale that I talk about on my channel, about which I'm going to acknowledge at the outset that it was an overly hasty Bale. And so I'll probably go back to it, but not anytime soon. I bailed on this book that I had been so enthusiastic about from Brazil, The Love of Singular Men by Victor Heringer, translated from the Portuguese by James Young. I mean, I had my own personal reasons, and I'm not going to get into too much personal stuff when I talk about why, but as I have said before on this channel, and I've gotten comments that made me realize that this is something that's really weird about me, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but it's a truth about me as a reader and as a person that I am deeply uninterested in reading about murder. And there are exceptions. So I enjoy reading war fiction. I enjoy, maybe enjoy is not the right, but I can really get deeply into books where it's something to do with politics and genocide or anything like that. Any themes about war or social political persecution where people get killed, that I'm not bored by that. I am really uninterested in like the crimes of passion kind of murders or anything like that. Like, I hate the murder mystery genre. That will never change. I'm not going to go on a tangent about why, but just this novel, it's foregrounded for us from just about page 1 that the first-person narrators, prepubescent, like are they even teenagers? I can't remember, but they're like maybe 13 or 15-year-old boys, and that his boyfriend, who's brought into his house under mysterious circumstances, and he begins a romantic sexual relationship with, they're about the similar age, 13, 14, 15, that boyfriend gets murdered. And I found the farther I get into the novel, the more it bugged me. Like, I know he's going to die, so just, like, I don't even care. Like, oh my God. And then I began to worry that in the second timeline, closer to the present, where our protagonist is middle-aged, that he was going to exact revenge on somebody. And I just thought, this is so, no. I mean, the writing was beautiful, but in a huff, and an overly hasty huff, I put it down on page 132, and the novel's only 180 pages. So there's 50 pages left for me to read. I'm not going to do it anytime soon. This was a buddy read that I abandoned with Jo Smith, and she told me stuff about the ending that made me realize, I misjudged it. But I do have this thing, and I'm not going to explore it publicly with you because you all just think I'm weird, that I think murder is a really boring theme in literature, and revenge, just like, oh God, I just want like my family dramas with, sibling conflict or... Oh, enough said. I bailed. I think it was too soon. I will go back, but maybe in about 20 years. And having bailed on that, I think last weekend, it created some more space to delve into other books that I have on the go. One of them is my new buddy read with Heidi of My Reading Life, who, as we speak, I think is in New York City with Doris. Oh my God. I hope they're vlogging the heck out of that experience. I know Doris will be. And that is The Deluge by Stephen Markley. We're doing it about 50 pages a week because I can't handle any more than that. It'll take us months to finish it, and I'm already realizing that was exactly the right pace because this first 50 pages just knocked my socks off, and I'm glad that I'm going to get to savor it. I'm having the same kind of smitten reaction to how this book opened as I did to my top read of last year, Collected Works. So, whether it carries on to be as mind-blowing as Collected Works was last year, but I'm expecting big things from it because of how much I loved Stephen Markley's debut, Ohio, and how strong the opening was. So most of you already know about this book. It's kind of like Cli-Fi. It opens in 2013, and then it's going to jump all over the place into the future. And there's going to be a large cast of characters. But the opening chapter was a tour de force, and that is a scientist who's studying methane hydrates and their connection to global warming. And I'm not a science person at all, and I'm sure a lot of the science of all that went over my head, but I found it completely engrossing. So Stephen Markley managed to make it kind of at least partially accessible to me and really interesting to me. And he opens a piece of mail at his lab one day, and some white powder comes out, and so the FBI gets called, and it turns out it's a false alarm. It was sent with a threatening letter to intimidate him, but it wasn't a dangerous substance. What did they say it was? Cornmeal or something? Cornmeal powder? But in just a few short pages, Markley takes me right inside this scientist character, Tony, embeds me in his world of research, his politics, and his family life in a way that makes me care so goddamn much about him by page 14 that I was gasping for breath. And then the next chapter is a man and a woman at a greasy spoon breakfast place. They hooked up, had a one-night stand several years before, both being involved in the anti-Iraq peace movement. The guy is an Iraq veteran, and she is an activist. And she has a new project she wants to recruit him for. And he was kind of hoping that she was wanting to meet him for another roll in the hay. And so I'm not sure where all that's going, but that was also fascinating, including sidebars where we get deeper into that Iraq veteran's consciousness and thoughts and experiences. That really worked for me because I wasn't sure if it would, because you have to kind of step out of the main narrative to read the sidebars. I just loved it so much. And then the third chapter is more traditionally narrated, and it's called The Actor, where a young woman who didn't get a promotion she wanted at work is drowning in her sorrows by going to the local Barnes and Nobles, trying to calm down at being passed over for this opportunity that everybody in the office thought was hers, this promotion, and it's given to somebody that was underneath her, that was a man, and she's presumably justifiably irate when she gets chatted up by a quite famous movie star who, against perhaps her better judgment, she allows to chat her up to the point that he takes her out for dinner, and then more plot ensues from there. That chapter, I thought, that it was more traditionally told, and I'm pretty traditional in kind of my tastes and how a story gets told to me, but open to some experimentation. So it wasn't the traditional narrative but I just felt of the three chapters, that one was a little bit less impressive, or I didn't get so invested in those characters. Not yet. However, I am really already deeply invested in how this novel has opened and eager to continue. So that was a huge hit. I'm going to start two books, and one I'm hoping to do within a week, and that's the audiobook of Animal Farm by George Orwell. It's time for me to get started on my novella reading for the project that the second annual novella book club, the novella discussion that I'm having with the Calgary, Alberta novelist Barb Howard. One of the novels she presented for me to read is Animal Farm, and so I figure I can probably knock that off. That doesn't sound very respectful to the work of literature, but it can probably do within a week on audio. So I'm going to do that. And then a book that I have been dying to read since I first read the opening page and a bit on my book haul back in Japan. And Joe wants to read it too. So we're going to start our buddy read of this. And it's not quite as long as The Deluge. The Deluge is 900 pages. This one is 540. This story, at least opens in the mid-20th century in Bengal, which in 1940, how well do I know my South Asian history? It's just before the partition. So before Pakistan becomes a political entity, and then later Bangladesh gets carved out of Pakistan. I think I've got that right. So it's set in the middle of all that tumult, and have I even said the title yet? Khwabnama. It's all one word. Khwabnama by Akhteruzzaman Elias. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And translated from the Bengali by Arunava Sinha. I was so transfixed by the way this novel opens that I've just been dying to read it. And, with all the priorities and commitments I tend to make in my reading life that enrich my reading life so much, but kind of squeeze out spontaneous reading. I was so delighted that Joe Smith wanted to buddy read this with me, so we're gonna start. So yeah, it starts around the time that Pakistan comes into being, but it's set in the Bengal region. It opens with a young farmhand who becomes a sharecropper and has big dreams, but then takes on larger social political themes as well. And I just, at the risk of repeating myself, I just freaking loved how the opening narrative, I don't remember it very well now. I'm going to put a link to that book haul video so you can get a taste of how it opens. That's how I hooked Joe into buddy reading it with me. So, that is this week's Friday Reads. Thanks for watching.